Hello and welcome to the War and Peace in the Pacific International Initiative. Before we begin the proceedings, we would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of this land on which we meet. We at Amaroo School would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of this land. We would like to pay our respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal Nation, both past and present. We extend this respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people watching today. My name is Maddie Calder.
I'm Leah Wallner.
I'm Daniel Lovella.
I'm Darcy Tennant.
And I'm Isabel Morrissey.
We are Year 10 students at Amaroo School and we are your presenters today. We are honoured to be given this opportunity and would like to welcome all participating schools around the world and all schools watching. 75 years ago, the largest ever foreign attack on Australia took place at Port Darwin in a bombing and strafe of the harbour and surrounding areas. On the 19th of February 1942 at 9:58 am, mainland Australia came under attack for the first time ever. Japanese forces mounted 2 air raids on Darwin, killing 252 Allied personnel and civilians.
So what was the bombing of Darwin? Well, Japan first attacked Darwin on the 19th of February 1942. This was the first time since European settlement in Australia that they had been attacked by a foreign force. There were nearly 400 casualties, with 252 killed and approximately 160 wounded. From 14,000 feet, 27 Kate twin-engine bombers opened the attack on Darwin, followed by a formation of Val dive bombers, escorted by 27 Zero fighters. The Kates were to pattern bomb in runs across the harbour, using 500kg high explosives. The Vals and Zeros were to follow with low-level dive bombing using 60kg high explosives and 60kg anti-personnel explosives, all taking out individual ships, flying boats, and land installations. Parachute incendiary bombs were also utilised in the bombing, though reportedly only in the first raid and against the shipping.
It was the dive bombing that caused majority of the damage on the harbour. A 12,000-ton transport, the Meigs, and 4 other merchant ships sunk and 3 were beached. The hospital ship, Menanda, was damaged. The Rand lost 14-ton lugger and the supply hulk. The 2 Catalinas were destroyed, but the Empire flying boat survived under a screen of smoke. The shore and the end of the wharf was hit by a heavy bomb that killed 21 waterside workers and blew a railway engine into the sea. At the wharf, the Neptuna, carrying 200 depth charges, was set on fire.
The purpose of the operation was to neutralise the Allied troops and Navy forces that were stationed in Port Darwin, and to destroy shipping, aircraft and ground installations. Apart from the fact that the bombing of Darwin was the largest single attack ever mounted by a foreign power on Australia, it was the first of about 100 air raids during World War II that Australia was subject to. Civilians were killed in the February attack, but that wasn't the focus of the bombing. This was because Australia and US were using Darwin military bases to stage a resistance to the Japanese invasion of Timor and Java. Australia had already declared war on Japan in the previous year before the bombings. Compared to the Pearl Harbor attack, Darwin sustained more damage from the high amount of bombs, but Pearl Harbor had a drastically higher death toll.
Australia had declared war on Japan on the 9th of December 1941. Given Japan's large history of invasions of enemy areas and strategic military planning, it was no surprise that the bombing of Darwin was such a great tragedy. The attack was led by Mitsuo Fuchida, who was the captain of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service and responsible for the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which had occurred 10 weeks prior. This leads to the question, why did Japan bomb Australia? And why Darwin specifically? During the Second World War, Darwin was a crucial defensive area against Japan. Due to this, Australia improved Darwin's airfields and military ports. The improvements of Darwin's military also included the building of coastal batteries and anti-aircraft guns. As well as this, Australia also gradually grew its garrison troops. Darwin was viewed as a main area for Allied ships, planes and forces that were defending Indonesia and East Timor, which was then known as the Dutch East Indies. Air raid precautions, ARP, organisations of all states and territories had taken actions and preparations for the reality of Japanese bombing. ARP wardens were prepared to direct people into shelters, report on damage in the area, as well as organise emergency services. This meant that these wardens had to ensure that blackout regulations were observed, air raid shelters were maintained, and registered kept displayed where people lived.
At the time, it was believed that the Japanese bombing Darwin was a step towards invading Australia. However, the Japanese were also aiming to eradicate as much of Australia's and the Allied nations' forces. The Japanese planned this attack in order to gain full control over Timor.
We're now going to talk about some primary sources that we gathered about the bombing of Darwin. This is a diary entry of a young boy called Christopher Forrest. The diary entry describes the events of the bombing of Darwin. Christopher wrote after he moved with his family from Darwin down to South Australia. Everyone is shaken and no one really knows what is going on. So many families have missing family members. I'm very scared. We all are. What if we all get killed? I can tell mother and father are thinking the same thing. I can see it in their eyes. But they don't want me to know they're scared, but I already know. This diary entry provides insight into the event and how it affected a wide variety of people in Darwin.
Shown here is a trailing edge of wingtip from an I-Chief D3A1 Val dive bomber shot down during its first Japanese air raid on the Australian mainland. The wing section is made up from aircraft-grade aluminium, which is of riveted construction and is painted grey with an extensive chipping and scratching. The trailing edge of the wingtip has a black attachment for an aerial which would have also been attached to the fuselage. On one side, wingtip from Japanese plane shot down over Darwin in first raid 7/2/1942 is scratched into the object. A red painted section from the wing is visible where the wingtip separated from the wing. The wingtip shows significant impact and damage.
This primary source is an aluminium data plate. This plate was from a Mitsubishi G4M1 Betty bomber shot down on 23rd of November 1942 over Darwin. The top line of the data plate translates to part number with the stamp number of 5414 adjacent to it. The lower line translates to inspection seal, which is associated with the manufacturer and part approval. Adjacent to the inspection seal are 4 symbols that have been stamped on the plate. These symbols are a Japanese cherry blossom or a sakura, a Mitsubishi symbol, plus 2 other symbols of indeterminate meaning. The final, lower one is likely to be an inspector's unique stamp or hanko.
The first air raids were known as the worst out of 64 air raids during the course of the first day of attacks in November 1943. This raid had caused widespread devastation and destruction, leaving 243 people dead and 350 at the least. Coast watchers on the ground had spotted the first wave of Japanese fighters from 9:15 a.m. An unusually large air formation bearing down from the northwest triggered 2 warnings by radio, no later than 9:37 a.m. Despite this, RAAF commanders dismissed them, believing planes to be Lieutenant Ostraker and his flight of Kitty Hawks heading for Timor. No action was taken, and Darwin was unprepared for the unexpected attack. This raid was not confirmed until Ostraker and his fellow pilots were attacked. The 5 Kitty Hawks were a part of a flight of 10 aircrafts en route from Darwin to Timor. The Kitty Hawks were in air during Japan's attack. This meant that they were unprepared to defend Darwin to the best of their abilities. Lieutenant Robert Ostraker was an American pilot known for putting up good resistance against Japanese air attacks. After 4 lieutenant pilots were shot down by a sudden Japanese Zero warplane, Ostraker was on his own. Rather than flee, Ostraker made his decision to fight back, despite possibly being the very last Allied plane on the air. Ostraker's defiant attempt to stop a fleet of Japanese planes arriving to bomb Darwin would of course be considered an impossible task. Yet he pursued and managed to take down at least 1 enemy aircraft, if not 2. His P-40E Kitty Hawk, being badly damaged, was forced to land at Darwin Airport under continuing enemy attack, in which he miraculously survived.
There was no chance of anyone stopping the attack, having 188 aircrafts in the first wave alone. The deadly Japanese fleet included 36 A6M0 fighter aircrafts, 71 D3A Val dive bombers, and 81 B5N Kate high-level bombers. These would also be followed by 54 land-based bombers within 80 minutes. It was the morning when Japan dispatched its first onslaught on Darwin. Having defeated Ostraker and the Kitty Hawks, the Japanese commenced their assault just after the air raid alarm sounded at 9:58 a.m. The first attacks had been led and planned by Japanese commander Mitsu Fuchida. who was the same commander that had been responsible for the attack on Pearl Harbor only 2 months earlier. In an offensive that had been the largest attack since Pearl Harbor, Japan launched fighters from land bases and aircraft carriers in the Timor Sea. Despite the damage already caused, this was only the beginning. Darwin's military civilian aerodromes, the hospital and the ships in the harbour were attacked by dive bombers. The Japanese dive bombers were accompanied by fighter planes in order to protect them from the Australian and Allied forces. In total, 8 Australian ships were sunk and numerous others were damaged in the harbour by Japanese bombs or machine gun fire. The Allies had limited air defence that consisted of 10 fighter planes. These planes defended Darwin against the Japanese fighter planes. 1 fighter from the Allied forces survived the first attacks, while the Japanese only suffered a few losses. The first attack was approximately 40 minutes long. The Japanese targeted the post office, telegraph office, cable office, and the postmaster's residence, where some postal workers lost their lives.
The second attack started an hour after the first attack was finished. The Royal Australian Air Force Base in Parrap was attacked heavily by bombers and lasted 25 minutes. From the 2 raids, an estimated 243 Australians and Allies were killed with 400 people wounded. It wasn't only humanity that suffered. Darwin's vehicles and buildings were also demolished. 20 military aircrafts and 8 anchored ships were also destroyed. Darwin was attacked repeatedly during the course of 1942 with other areas across northern Australia, including Learmont, Broome, Milingimbi, Horn Island and Townsville being bombed as well.
The nation's perspective on the event and how it impacted Australia then and now. The bombing of Darwin was an unforgettable moment in Australia's history, and is perhaps one of the biggest events that took place. Today, Australia does not just remember it as another historical event, but looks at it as a defining moment in our past and future. The bombing of Darwin brought the war home to a country previously untouched by foreign conflict. The bombing itself left several traumatic effects on people, including future generations. Darwin was issued an evacuation by the rattled Australian government only a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. They suspected a possible attack after the Japanese gained occupation over Singapore, which meant that they had the military bases closer to Australia, posing a bigger threat to the nation. In response to this, the government felt that there could be a possibility of an attack to the country, therefore leading an evacuation. Nobody believed the attack was actually going to take place. During the evacuation, inhabitants were not allowed to take enough belongings to last them and had to leave their homes without proper explanations. The government did promise safety and welfare for the public, however, it proved to be far from the truth. Most people, specifically women, did not want to leave their houses as they thought it to be unnecessary. Furthermore, the evacuation was extremely stressful, which resulted in refusal and useless protests for several days. The population of Darwin was not provided with the comforts and accommodations with which they were promised. People did not have money, warm clothes, proper food, and were not provided with enough information about what was happening and why. Many women and men who had stayed behind and volunteered to care for their soldiers were killed.
Although the Australian forces had been greatly involved in World War I as well as World War II, which was occurring at the time, they were not a major target, therefore the bombing of Darwin was extremely unprepared for. The attack on Darwin was the first real threat to Australia's safety and evoked major fear in the public. Gunner Mulholland, an Australian soldier who fought on the Battle of Darwin, stated, "Nobody says anything about what happened in Darwin, and Darwin was a battle. Ask the blokes who were in the ships when they were being pounded. As far as I'm concerned, the name should be the Battle for Darwin instead of the Battle of Darwin." Mulholland was 20 years old when he was met with the devastating outcomes of the Darwin bombings. It is a horrific memory which many people like Mulholland will never forget. Due to the governmental attempts of hiding the attacks from the population, the fear of the public was increased, causing Australians to believe that they would get invaded by the Japanese. Australians were kept in the dark about the attacks for a considerably large amount of time, which does not provide much reassurance or improve trust within people. Although the war had profuse impacts on Australia's safety and took the lives of many people, it did contribute greatly to the Australian efforts for increasing the contributions made for war effort and for protection. Darwin was reinforced as a fortress and as a base for Allied troops, and more military camps were set up.
Although the devastation suffered after the bombing was intense, The Australian spirit and tendency of those living came to the fore as they showed their commitment and their courage to rebuilding Darwin. Darwin was eventually rebuilt after the war and has grown into a cosmopolitan tropical city. The bombing shook the nation and forced Australians to challenge their views of their budding nation and its place in the world. The bombing of Darwin remains the largest foreign attack on Australian soil. The attack caused Australians to reflect deeply on the cost of nationhood. Previously, Australia sought alliances to provide military assistance, but now realise this responsibility rested within the Commonwealth. February 19th is now a reminder of the serious safety of each citizen and aspect of infrastructure. The attack on Darwin has had the greater influence than the landings at Gallipoli in 1915, with regard to the nation's defence and security, and in terms of national spirit. The attack was humiliating and embarrassing, and the Japanese attack was brutal and merciless. After the initial attack, there was utter chaos. Australian people were left in the dark about the destruction and citizen conduct. Australians realised that their nationhood involves privileges and possibilities, but also obligation and responsibilities. It was not just the bombing which struck Darwin, but the consequences which were to follow the attacks. After the attack, most of the town was destroyed, with hundreds killed and injured. Panic arose as people feared Japanese invasions, causing around half of the remaining civilization population to flee over the next few days. Many servicemen also left their posts.
After the bombings and long-term impacts. The bombing of Darwin made a significant impact on Australia, both a short while after it happened, but also 75 years later. Directly after the second air raid, Darwin was thrown into chaos and panic. Local civil administrations were deplorable due to fear, and the military were insufficient in their preparations to further defend Darwin if necessary. The political responses was very evasive, as the Australians living outside of Darwin were not giving solid information. Instead, the information released to the public was filtered and some details were suppressed. The government ensured that the public was unaware about the true devastation of the attacks. This was due to the government being unwilling for the nation to go into a state of panic during a crucial moment in war.
After the bombing of Darwin, former residents were hesitant to return to their homes in fear of another raid. This displays that the bombing of Darwin's impacted people both physically and mentally. After the first attack, the residents of Darwin quickly fled and retreated to the south of the Adelaide River, over 100 kilometres away. This group of people were called the Adelaide River Stakes. To this day, we remember the bombing of Darwin. Every year, a commemoration service is held by the Darwin Cenotaph, in which the Prime Minister and the Governor-General both attend. At 9:58 a.m, air raid sirens are sounded in memory of the bombings. 2017 marks the 75th anniversary of the bombing of Darwin.
Alright, I'd like to introduce Ian Foster, who is a volunteer at the War Memorial, and he's come in here today to answer some questions for us. So Ian, what do you know about the bombing of Darwin?
Well, February 19th, 1942. It's a lovely, bright, sunny day, which is unusual for the wet season. Things were pretty quiet in Darwin. It's a very small country town those days. There was no railway line connecting Darwin with the rest of Australia. The line finished just about 100 miles or so out of town. So it was very isolated, very small. And a bunch of Japanese aircraft arrived in the morning and bombed and attacked the city and the ships in the harbour. They went away, and about 2 hours later a whole bunch of bombers came in and they took out the airbase out near Casuarina, or the suburb of Casuarina is these days. There was no adequate warning of it, even though people knew they were coming, because no one took the warning from the Aboriginal settlement on Bathurst Island seriously. They thought they just mucked it up. They thought there were some American planes that might have been lost, so they didn't take it seriously. More people killed in that attack on Darwin than any of the other following, many attacks over the next 2 years, but more people killed in that one than in any of the others.
So what are your opinions of the events and what happened after?
It was very top secret, hush-hush, how bad it had been. It was kept from Australians for many years. Even after the war, it wasn't talked about, because what happened was very embarrassing. There was what was called the Adelaide River Stakes, which is like a horse race, because the mad rush to get down the track, get out of Darwin. People were scared to death, including those who deserted their posts. and one man kept running and didn't finish running until he was found in Adelaide, in fact. Adelaide River was the first decent place down the track, and they all finished up down there, quite a few of them. In fact, that's where all the dead of the attack are buried, at Adelaide River, the war cemetery there. So it was very embarrassing. Why weren't we prepared? Why didn't we expect it? Why did we have no fighter aircraft there at all? The Japanese couldn't believe how easy it was. If you look at the newsreels, which you can see on YouTube and whatever, Japanese weren't really opposed seriously. There happened to be some American aircraft in Darwin that day. They were heading towards Timor and got lost in the wet season. It's pretty hard navigating if you're a single engine, a single pilot plane. And so they got lost and came back to Darwin, and they knew that things, I think it was under attack at the actual time they got there, so 5 went into land to refuel, the other 5 stayed in the air, then the other 5 took off from land. Most of those, they were virtually all shot down or seriously damaged. There were 4 Americans killed, and any Australian aircraft that were at the airbase in that second raid, they were virtually all destroyed completely. None of them were fighters. One was a medium bomber, and there were some training aircraft that had guns attached. They were called general purpose aircraft, but they weren't much good for modern warfare. The Japanese had gone a long way. They'd flown from East Timor, the fighters, which was a long distance, or to West Timor rather, from Kupang, and the large bombers came in all the way from Sulawesi, which is a very long, much further than we could fly. So we thought the Japanese were about to invade because we couldn't fly from those distances. We assumed must be aircraft carriers off the coast, and they're all coming. Well, they weren't coming, they just flown a long way. The police deserted, the soldiers deserted, the airmen deserted, ran off down the track where any truck they could find. They looted the houses mercilessly. There was no good news coming out of Darwin. The Japanese did a very good job that day, and we did a very bad job. And that couldn't be talked about for a long while afterwards.
What were the impacts of the bombing of Darwin on our nation?
Well, this time, because Americans had, at that time, America had probably about 150 fighter aircraft in Australia that they were using, or in the middle of ferrying up to the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia. But we had no fighter aircraft. We hadn't asked for any fighter aircraft, which was a mistake by the government the year before. The new government, the Curtin government, they'd requested the British for some fighter aircraft, and the British said no. And then after the bombing of Darwin, we said to the Americans, we really need some fighters. And the Americans said, we'll promise you 40 a month for the next 3 months, which was enough to start our first fighter squadrons in Australia. Until then, the Americans were doing some things to help us, but more to service Java. But then when Timor fell, just after Darwin was bombed, when Timor fell, they could no longer ferry aircraft up to Java, because they needed to stop in Timor on the way, which meant all the American aircraft in Australia at that time, which was about 300 fighter aircraft, could be used a bit more for Australia's defence, and set up our first 3 squadrons, 75, 76 and 77. March, if you think about it, in March our first fighter squadrons, the war began the previous December, Hong Kong's gone, January, Rabaul's gone, February, Singapore's gone, and in March we had our first fighter aircraft.
Wow.
Bad decision making, eh?
Yeah.
And we had radar in Darwin, but it wasn't working that day. They hadn't finished setting it up. And this is in 1942. The British had radar for the Battle of Britain in 1940. Why? What were they thinking? How did it make sense to them? I can't understand what they were thinking, where they could make such silly decisions on stuff they knew at the time. Not stuff we had learned later, stuff they knew at the time. How did some people come up with these ideas? They weren't uneducated. They'd been to university. They were sophisticated, well-educated. These public leaders and military leaders. Some had been through World War I, so they knew what a bad business war was. Why weren't they concerned?
Do you think the bombing of Darwin had a similar effect on our sense of nationhood as the battle at Gallipoli?
A very different effect. I'm not one of those who subscribes to the idea that Australia was born on the sands of Gallipoli. I think there were far more important events in our history. That was important, but not as big as some of the other ones. We lost 5 times as many on the Western Front as we lost in Gallipoli. We might have lost 9,000 Australians dead in 9 months at Gallipoli. We lost 2,000 in 2 days at Fromelles. It was a whole quanta more dangerous, the Western Front. But we've got this romantic attachment to Gallipoli. I've walked Gallipoli sands, I've been there. Darwin, Australia's land, for the first time was attacked by an enemy force. Australians were killed in Australia on Australian soil, killed by the enemy. This is earth-shattering. And it was all kept a secret because our response to being attacked was not very good. And that wasn't, we had to really shake things up. So a guy called later Sir Frederick Sherger, who ran TAA, or before Qantas, he was sent up there. There was a committee of inquiry to shape the whole thing up. And the squadron leader was sacked, and the administrator was sacked, and the police chiefs, I think they were sacked as well, for making a whole mess of the whole thing. It was serious. It was really serious. And because that February was about a week or so after Singapore had fallen, and Singapore was supposed to save us forever. And then a month later, we had Japanese submarines in Sydney Harbour. Townsville was bombed and shelled. Newcastle was shelled. It was serious business. Up until then, they just kept the race meetings. We kept on going. They had Mother's Days and Father's Days. After that, they cancelled public holidays. No one could take a break. You either had to be a student at school, or you had to have a job, or you had to be in uniform. There were no other choices permitted. The youngest person on the roll of honour at the War Memorial is Year 9. And there were quite a lot in Year 9. When you talk to your old grandparents, whose parents and grandparents these people were, they'd often throw this term around, which today is very insulting, but at the time it wasn't. They talk about the boys and girls who went off to war. They were. There were very few of them under 25.
Well, we have a final question here. What were the links between the bombing of Darwin and Australia's alliances and involvement in the war?
Very interesting. The Americans, because they've been passing through Darwin, ferrying these planes to Java for the Dutch forces in Java, they realised they had to take Australia seriously. The Japanese had already, we didn't know about it by the way, but the Japanese had already decided they were not going to invade Australia. They had 1 million soldiers fighting in China. So it wasn't important to Australia that China won. It was terribly important China never lost. So if you see a Chinese tourist in town, please remember to thank them, because otherwise we'd all be speaking very good Japanese. So we were happy to embrace the Americans, and they were happy to embrace us because this gave America an unsinkable aircraft carrier. They got loaded up with planes and the Japanese couldn't sink it because they'd sunk quite a few American aircraft carriers by then. So they get a secure base, and it's not insignificant today. The Americans have gone back to the same pattern. They're cycling servicemen and certainly heavy aircraft through Darwin and the Northern Territory. It really gave a base for the Americans. The American General MacArthur, in his escape from the Philippines, landed a little town just south of Darwin called Batchelor. Darwin was a bit too dangerous still by then. It's just after the Darwin raid. And so he set up his headquarters in Menzies Hotel in Melbourne and later moved to the Gold Coast, and that was the headquarters in Brisbane rather. So, similar to that, the British were so busy staying alive in Europe they had nothing to spare for us. And despite our emotional attachment to Britain, the mother country and that sort of stuff, we had to accept the fact there was no help coming from Britain. And we couldn't build that many planes in Australia. We could build some, but not many. And so the only choice was to befriend the Americans. There was a lot of reluctance. We tried to think, people say we embraced the American alliance. If you read things people actually wrote at the time, it was a bit begrudging to embrace the Americans because they're a very different culture. It's a foreign culture. Whereas most of us were very British. Most Australians in the 1940s, if they hadn't been born in Britain, their parents probably were. We were a very, very British country. And so you had to give up. There was no help coming from Britain. Britain had told us or lied to us about it, whatever, but that wasn't coming. So we embraced a foreign alliance. There were no other choices. There's no point having New Zealand as a friend. There's no one living there. And China was too busy fighting for its own life, and the other countries had gone under. So I guess it made us think seriously about America. It was more than just nice milkshakes and coloured movies. It was more substantial than that. In general, the quality of the engineering was better in the Americas. The American airplanes didn't crash as often as the British ones. They could fly much further than the British ones. So once we got, it gave us permission to buy American aircraft. Until then, the British would not let us buy American aircraft. Once they couldn't supply them themselves, we could then buy Catalina flying boats instead of British Sunderlands. Catalinas could fly twice as far. There'd be Sunderlands that would have been useless in the Pacific Ocean. They couldn't fly anywhere near far enough. We could then build American airplane engines in Melbourne, which meant when we put We made the Beaufort bomber in Australia. The British couldn't supply engines, so we could put American engines built in Australia onto these aircraft. They flew about 200 miles an hour faster than the ones with British engines. So we get access to better engineering and a huge resort base. But we shouldn't be too romantic about it. Even with the embrace of the American alliance, at no time did the Pacific War attract anything more than 15% of the Allies' resources. 85% went to the war against Germany and Europe. Only 15% was ever allocated to the fight against the Japanese. So, although we embraced them, they were still more heavily embracing Churchill and the Brits. To be realistic about it, we were small players fighting for our lives. In fact, Britain's plan was that Australia, it's okay, as long as we can save India, the empire will survive. And so, if we do lose Australia, we can always capture them back later when we eventually win the war. Well, that's why a very famous speech by John Curtin, you probably do in your history things, where he talks about looking to America, said that Britain can go under and survive, but Australia's not going to go under. We are going to fight to keep it. We're not going to just sacrifice ourselves to save Britain down the track. And it was a very controversial thing to say. Australia was not going to be a sacrificial lamb for Britain. This was very controversial. He was the first Australian Prime Minister ever buried under the blue flag, which we have as the Australian flag now. Up until then you had to be buried under a Union Jack for all state funerals. But he brought a special rule in 1943 during the war saying if you want to get buried under the blue ensign, as it was called, instead of the Union Jack, you can. He was the first PM buried under the blue flag.
Well, thank you, Ian, for coming in today.
I wonder because it's your story. They're your age, not mine. These are young boys, youngest 18 to 25. They had wing commanders with 60 men's lives under them who were just under 24. I can't remember being 24. I can just because I was single until 24.
Alright. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ian.
I've enjoyed it.
We've enjoyed it. Thank you for coming.
This is a newspaper clipping from the Macleay Argus on Tuesday, March 17th, 1942. Writing to his parents, Mr. and Mrs. H.J. Edstein of Kempsey, QMS Eric Edstein advises that in the bombing of Darwin recently, enemy bombs left large craters in the main thoroughfares. One crater contained an unexploded bomb, and this was successfully removed and rendered harmless. He states that his brother, Staff Sergeant Ned Edstein, had the job of obtaining a tractor and scoop.
This is from the Telegraph on Wednesday, March 11, 1942. These pictures show the effect of the Japanese bombings on Darwin Hospital and give the lie to Tokyo's claim that no hospitals, only military objectives were attacked. Portions of the Red Cross, plainly marked on the roof and easily visible from the air, are evident from the low level from which these photos were taken. Above, the damage is seen from two angles.
This is a newspaper clipping from the Newcastle Morning Herald and the Miners' Advocate on Friday the 20th of February 1942. Yesterday morning, the sirens were heralding an air raid test in Newcastle. An hour earlier, they were giving at Darwin a real alarm, which was repeated in the afternoon. It has for some time been summarised that Darwin would be the first point of Australian mainland to be subject to an air attack. It is of strategical importance, always considerable, and has been greatly increased by the fall of Singapore, and Darwin is now for both Australia and Japan a crucial front of the war. It will cause no dismay and raise no doubt, if it underlies the very real peril in which the whole of Australia now stands. That will be the steel revolution of the people to defend their homeland with every little of their strength and skill. The falling of bombs on the Australian mainland will destroy whatever shred of complacency lingered in this country. It will cause no dismay and raise no doubts, if it underlies the very real peril in which the whole of Australia now stands. But that will be but the steel revolution of the people to defend their homeland and every title of their strength and skill. Australia's peaceful progression of her island continent, never hitherto questioned, has now been challenged, and the answer will not be wanting. The bombing of Darwin is a call to every man and woman to stand fast, to put aside all facile hopes and false illusions, and by service to the nation in one form or another, to help defend its title to the white Australia, which is the product of a century and a half of pioneering. That title, won by sweat, privation, and can only be confirmed in sweat and blood. But in this harsh task of the nationhood, Australians will neither flinch nor fail.
We would like to acknowledge those who fought in the bombing of Darwin, those who suffered and those who lost. Darwin in 1942 was in a horrific condition. Those who lived there suffered immensely. Their state was torn to shreds by the opponent, and if it weren't for the Allies, they would have been in a much worse situation than they already were. We would also like to acknowledge the vulnerable people who may have been mentioned or shown today. We would like to point out that some of the people may already be deceased which have been mentioned. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were widely mobilised during the war, especially in Northern Australia. An estimated 3,000 of them enlisted as soldiers, sailors or airmen, whilst a further 150 served as regular soldiers, patrolling parts of Arnhem Land on Bathurst and Melville Islands, and at Groote Island. Another 3,000 worked as labourers employed by the military forces. Indigenous Australians used their knowledge of the bush to assist observe the units and to rescue crashed airmen. Their service went mostly unnoticed. Some did not receive their full pay or service medals for many years. A few Indigenous servicemen became well known, such as Reg Saunders, the first Aboriginal to be commissioned in the Australian Army, and Len Waters, the first Aboriginal fighter pilot.
This brings us to the conclusion of our documentary about the bombing of Darwin. This tragedy was a truly defining moment in Australian history and remains to be an event which we commemorate to this day. However, the trauma Australians experienced during these attacks created strength and cohesiveness within the community. We hope that this video provided significant insight into the bombing of Darwin. I'm Maddie Calder.
I'm Leah Wallner.
I'm Daniel Labella.
I'm Darcy Tennant.
And I'm Isabel Morrissey.
Thank you for watching.